It moved, but no one was behind it. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Reading your notes brings me joy. Let's begin. There was, as always in St. Aldhelm's, the sense that everything was in its proper place. The primrose beds were precisely edged, the brass of the church lectern gleamed weakly with Mrs. Hubbard's lemon polish, and even the jackdaws that nested in the bell tower seemed to caw with practiced moderation. It was June, the time when the village exhaled into summer, and the vicarage garden was dressed for the occasion. The summer fundraiser for the St. Aldhelm's Preservation Society had become, over the years, something between a pageant and a polite skirmish. Widows competed over sponge cakes, amateur painters angled for compliments, and the vicar's wife, who had once been a stage actress in modest regional productions, insisted on organising tableaux vivants of biblical scenes, though no one had requested them in years. That afternoon, the lawn behind the vicarage brimmed with tables and murmurs. Tea was served in mismatched cups. There was lemonade with a suspicion of gin, and the elderly gents wore their best Panama hats and argued about drainage. A quartet of schoolchildren plucked out tentative tunes beneath the sycamore tree, while their mothers fussed over vol au vents and jam. Among the spread of white linen and strawberries, Miss Marple sat placidly beside a hydrangea bush, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She sipped tepid tea and nodded gently to the vicar's wife, who was dressed as the Queen of Sheba and very much enjoying the attention. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured to no one in particular. "The wind's picked up. That curtain will flap itself loose." She was referring to the heavy burgundy velvet that hung in the rear of the makeshift stage, borrowed from the Women's Institute to provide theatrical flourish. For a moment, it stirred faintly, then stilled. The curtain rustled again as the tableau's narration began, and Solomon in all his glory. But the wind had stilled. A few eyes shifted curiously. The velvet lifted slightly at the hem. It was not until the vicar's wife struck a particularly dramatic pose that the curtain lifted higher, suddenly and sharply, and several gasps escaped the crowd. Behind it, half revealed by the parted folds, was a face. A man's face, slumped, slack, and unmistakably lifeless. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a teacup shattered against the ground. Mrs. Everett, who had been playing Bathsheba, screamed, a shrill, almost musical note. The curtain swayed wider with her movement, revealing the full body, limp in a chair meant to hold the fake throne. His suit was crumpled. His eyes stared unseeing at the vicar's prized dahlia bed. "Good heavens," someone muttered. "Is that—" "Yes," came a shaky voice. "That's Julian. Harmon." And it was. Julian Harmon, once the London theatre critic of middling repute, now a relatively new resident of St. Aldhelm's. He had purchased the old Lymington cottage near the footbridge 6 months ago, and had since become a subject of mixed opinion in the village. Too smooth by half, according to the butcher. Rather condescending, said Mrs. Fairley, the postmistress, but punctual with his tithes and charming in committee meetings. Most agreed he was trying to reinvent himself, whatever that meant. He had no wife, no children, and spent his days scribbling in notebooks at the Blue Goose Cafe, or wandering about in worn tweeds as though auditioning for a role he hadn't quite secured. Now he was dead behind a velvet curtain. The vicar's wife swayed, speechless for the first time in living memory, while the audience of villagers turned from curious to chaotic. Someone ran for Dr. Finch. Someone else, breathless and far too excited, declared it must be poison. Mrs. Limburner fainted into a rhododendron bush and had to be hauled out by her niece. Through it all, Miss Marple remained seated. Her tea had cooled entirely now, but she did not seem to mind. She watched with a distant sadness as the curtain was gently closed again by the trembling hands of the curate. "Poor man," she said softly. "I'm afraid he didn't live to see the second act." From the side path, Constable Rowntree appeared, awkward and perspiring, with his bicycle tipped into a shrubbery, and his notebook flapping open in the breeze. "Everyone, please stay where you are," he barked too loudly. "Nobody is to leave the garden. This is now a matter of of police business." The villagers froze, then rearranged themselves into tighter huddles. Several glanced at Miss Marple, half expecting her to rise and take charge. She did not. Not yet. Instead, she gently patted her handbag and turned her gaze once more to the heavy velvet curtain. "There's something so very final about velvet," she said quietly. "It hides rather more than it reveals." She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but if one had been close enough, they might have caught the way her eyes lingered. Not on the curtain or the stage, but on the second-floor window of the vicarage, just beside the guest room. A curtain fluttered there too, pale lace this time, and behind it, just for the briefest moment, a shape moved. A shoulder, a retreating head. Miss Marple said nothing, but she had seen, and as the crowd simmered with gossip and guesses, and the constable scribbled with red-faced determination, Miss Marple's mind had already begun to sort what was play-acting from what was real, because there had been something wrong with Julian Harmon. Not just now, in death, but before, weeks before. The way he asked questions that weren't quite casual, the way he'd flinched when someone mentioned the name Elspeth, the letter he'd dropped, outside the chemist's, the argument at the committee meeting about blackout curtains, too petty to be real. Yes, there was more to Julian Harmon than the villagers knew, and someone, behind that curtain, or in front of it, had known too much, or too little. Either way, Miss Marple suspected it hadn't been wind that moved the velvet. It had been guilt, or panic, or both, and that meant the real performance was only just beginning. A hush had fallen over the garden once more, the kind of hush that presses against the skin and makes people whisper even when there's no one to overhear. Julian Harmon's body had been removed at last, carefully, awkwardly, by Dr. Finch and Constable Rowntree, with the unhelpful assistance of Mr. Giles Elworthy, who fancied himself a man of action and was not. The chair he had been slumped in was still there, its faded upholstery now an object of great interest to the villagers more morbidly inclined. The velvet curtain hung heavy again, unmoving. Miss Marple had not shifted from her seat near the hydrangeas. The police from the nearby town had yet to arrive, summoned by telephone with great drama by the vicar's wife, once she had recovered her voice and her crown. In the meantime, the villagers hovered in loose formations on the lawn, watching one another, speaking in low tones, as if their voices might carry guilt. Miss Hartnell, a retired schoolmistress with the unfortunate habit of quoting poetry at inappropriate times, stood rigidly beside the jam table and muttered, "The moving finger writes, and having writ—" "Miss Hartnell," Miss Marple said gently, "perhaps now isn't quite the time for verse." "I beg your pardon," the woman murmured, somewhat chastened. She glanced about her, eyes darting toward the stage. "But one must admit, Jane, it's almost theatrical." Miss Marple offered a small nod. "Too theatrical, perhaps. Life is seldom arranged so precisely unless someone has been very deliberate." Miss Hartnell blinked. Are you suggesting the murderer meant him to be found like that? In the curtain?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied delicately, "that Mr. Harmon was not placed there by accident." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Finch, the doctor's wife, bearing a tray of untouched scones, as if determined that propriety must prevail. She offered one to Miss Marple, who declined with a kind smile. "Poor Julian," Mrs. Finch said softly, setting the tray down on the grass as though it were a gravestone. "Do you suppose it was his heart? He was always so pale. I noticed it last week when he was at the greengrocer's, stood too quickly and swayed, like a sapling." Miss Marple considered. "Did you mention that to Dr. Finch?" "Oh no," Mrs. Finch admitted. "Didn't seem my place, and Julian didn't seem the sort to like fuss." "Was he speaking to anyone?" Mrs. Finch paused, brow wrinkled. "No, not then." Though a few minutes later, Miss Morley passed by and he did give her quite a sharp look. Sharp? Miss Marple tilted her head. Well, not cruel, Mrs. Finch corrected. Just startled, as if he hadn't expected to see her, or perhaps hoped he wouldn't. Miss Marple thanked her and filed the detail away. Miss Morley, formerly of the London stage and now the local piano teacher, was known for her modest talents and immodest hats. She had a fondness for red velvet and always arrived at church slightly late, perhaps in memory of the curtain calls she'd once received. Her cottage was 2 doors down from Julian Harmon's, and though the village had wondered aloud if anything improper was occurring, both parties had remained, outwardly at least, solitary. Miss Marple looked over toward the lemonade table and, indeed, there was Miss Morley, standing stiffly, her crimson turban tilting precariously to one side. Her eyes, however, were steady and cold. She was watching the stage, or more precisely, watching the chair that had held Julian Harmon. Miss Marple rose at last. She moved with slow, purposeful steps through the garden, passing murmurs and sidelong glances. People nodded to her out of habit. Others stopped speaking entirely when she drew near. That was often the way. Miss Marple gave the appearance of being harmless, even forgetful, but the villagers knew better. She made her way toward the curtained stage and knelt just beside the edge of the platform, pretending to retrieve a fallen napkin. What she really examined was the underside of the steps, where the curtain had been weighted with metal rings, though one on the left side had come loose. Carefully, she touched the fabric. It was warm from the sun. No tears, no stains. But the hem bore faint scuff marks, as if someone had pulled it from the inside with a shoe. She straightened and dusted her hands. Constable Rowntree caught sight of her, and perhaps uncertain of his own authority, ambled over. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting gravity, "I do hope you're not interfering with a scene of a crime." "Not at all, Constable," she replied mildly. "Merely helping to tidy. You must be overwhelmed." He was, in fact, but brightened at her tone. "Well, I don't mind saying it's a right pickle. Could be poisoning. Could be strangling even. Dr. Finch says there's no visible wound. Not one." "And was the curtain drawn when you arrived?" she asked gently. "Oh, yes, I believe so. Someone had pulled it closed again. The curate, I think. Or one of the boys." "Why?" Miss Marple nodded, but did not answer. Instead, her eyes wandered again to the second floor of the vicarage. The lace curtain she had noticed earlier was now perfectly still. Constable Rowntree followed her gaze. "Guest room's empty, far as I know." "I see," she said, even though she didn't. As the constable busied himself with his notes again, Miss Marple moved quietly to the lemonade table, where Miss Morley still stood. "Miss Morley," she said, as if delighted to stumble upon her. "Such a shocking afternoon. May I sit?" Miss Morley blinked once, then nodded. "Please do." Miss Marple arranged her skirt and studied the younger woman's face. There was a tightness to it, a smoothing of expression so deliberate it might as well have been painted on. "You knew Mr. Harmon in London, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked softly. There was a flicker. Not fear, not guilt, but something flinty. "I did," Miss Morley said. "He reviewed me once, years ago, unkindly." "How very regrettable," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet you both chose to settle here. Coincidence, surely." "Perhaps." A pause. "You weren't close?" "No." The reply was crisp. Miss Marple nodded as if satisfied. But she thought of Mrs. Finch's remark, of the startled look Julian had given when seeing Miss Morley at the greengrocer's, as if the past had walked by in broad daylight and reminded him of something he'd rather forget. From the rose arbor came a sudden sound, a crack, like a branch snapping. Several heads turned, but no one moved. Miss Marple rose, excused herself, and drifted that way. The arbor was empty. But near the edge of the flower bed, she saw a crumpled piece of paper half tucked beneath a stone frog. She knelt, glancing about, then unfolded it carefully. A letter, not long, written in a precise, impatient hand. You have one chance to make this right. I won't be humiliated again. You know what I have. Either you tell them, or I will. Miss Marple read it twice, folded it neatly, slipped it into her handbag. Then she turned and walked back toward the crowd. Behind her, the velvet curtain stirred faintly, not with wind, but with memory. By the time Inspector Llewellyn arrived from Much Benham, the garden had acquired a subdued solemnity, like the last echoes after a bell has been struck. The guests had not dispersed, rather they had reorganized into careful groups, huddled like sheep, unsure of where the next gust of danger might come from. Chairs had been folded, trestle tables cleared of cakes, and the curate, still white about the mouth, had been quietly led inside by the vicar's wife for a little something calming. Inspector Llewellyn was a practical man with a hard moustache and a distaste for theatrics, which made the presence of Julian Harmon's body behind a velvet curtain somewhat irksome to his sensibilities. He conferred briefly with Constable Rowntree, issued a few brisk instructions to cordon the garden gate, and then turned his attention to the villagers with the kind of sharp-eyed focus that tends to make everyone feel vaguely guilty. Miss Marple, seated once more, observed him with faint approval. She liked men who listened before speaking, and Inspector Llewellyn was, if nothing else, precise. His glance swept the garden like a surveyor taking measure, calculating, deliberate, methodical. He approached her after a brief interval, removing his hat in deference. Miss Marple, I believe we've met during the matter of the Greenway pearls. Indeed we have, Inspector, she replied with a small nod. I remember you were very kind to Mrs. Bletchley, even after she fainted quite unnecessarily. He allowed himself a twitch of amusement. You were here at the time of Mr. Harmon's discovery. I was. She tilted her head. Though I'm afraid I have nothing sensational to report. I merely noticed the curtains stir when there was no wind. That in itself is something, he said, drawing out a small notebook. May I ask, had you any acquaintance with the deceased? Only in passing. He was a relatively new resident, though naturally one heard a bit here and there. The village, as you know, is a great sponge for personalities. Llewellyn made a note. Any impressions? Miss Marple folded her hands. He gave the appearance of trying to be liked, which is always rather curious, don't you think? People who want to be liked are often people who fear what might happen if they aren't. The inspector regarded her for a moment. You believe he had enemies? I believe, she said gently, that one doesn't threaten to expose someone unless one knows precisely which curtain to lift. The inspector blinked, then frowned. Pardon? Merely a thought, Miss Marple said. Please do go on. Inspector Llewellyn straightened. We've spoken to Dr. Finch. He was one of the first to approach the body. He suspects poisoning, no visible wounds, and a peculiar discoloration about the lips. The post-mortem will tell us more, but he believes it was administered recently, possibly within the hour of death. And what time does he estimate that to be? Miss Marple asked. Somewhere between 3:30 and 4. She nodded. Then I wonder who handed him a drink during the preparations. There was a tray of cordial passed around during the dress rehearsal. That, said Llewellyn, is exactly what we're about to find out. He stepped away to consult with Rowntree, while Miss Marple quietly opened her handbag and withdrew the letter she'd found near the arbour. The paper was thin, slightly wrinkled now from where she had folded it, and the ink had bled faintly at the corners. She reread the lines. You have one chance to make this right. I won't be humiliated again. You know what I have. Either you tell them, or I will. E. That single initial could have belonged to many people. She thought again of the faces in the garden. Mrs. Everett, for instance, whose thin smiles did little to disguise the disdain she held for most of the newcomers. Edwin Blythe, the choir director, who had taken Julian's polite suggestions about musical arrangements as personal affronts. Or Evelyn Morley, whose past with Harmon remained obscure, though clearly not pleasant. Miss Marple watched Miss Morley now, noting the tightness of her jaw, the pinched crease beside her left eye. She had not spoken again since their earlier exchange, nor moved much, except to sip slowly at a glass of lemonade that one suspected was mostly gin. The inspector turned back toward the group. "May I have everyone's attention? I'd like to ask a few of you some questions. Please remain here unless otherwise instructed." He gestured to one of the helpers, a teenager named Stephen, to begin clearing the area near the curtain stage. Stephen, lanky and solemn, approached nervously and tugged back the curtain one final time to reveal the chair, now empty. He knelt to remove it when something slipped from beneath the cushion and dropped onto the wooden boards with a dull thud. Everyone turned. Stephen picked it up and held it aloft uncertainly. A book. The inspector stepped forward. "May I?" It was a diary. The kind with gilt-edged pages and a flimsy little lock. But the lock had been forced, clumsily. Some of the pages near the back were torn. The inspector flipped through it, brows lifting. "It's not Harmon's handwriting," he muttered. "This is a woman's. At least—" Miss Marple stood. "May I?" she asked quietly. Llewellyn hesitated, then passed the diary to her. She read a few lines aloud, gently but clearly. "He said I was never to mention London again, that I was someone new here. But how can I be someone new when the old things still breathe beneath my skin? I see him watching the postman. I think he knows. I think he reads my letters. I burned the photographs. He said that was best. But I kept the ring. He doesn't know I still have it." A rustle went through the listeners. Inspector Llewellyn looked grave. "Miss Morley, do you recognize this?" She did not answer immediately. Her fingers dug into the stem of her glass. "No," she said finally. "I've never seen it before." Miss Marple glanced down again at the ink. A flourish on the S, a loop on the G. Not Morley's hand, she suspected, though similar. Someone affected. Someone performing on the page, as in life. But who? Inspector Llewellyn turned to the crowd. "If this diary belongs to anyone here, I strongly advise coming forward now. It may be crucial to establishing motive, or clearing someone of suspicion." No one moved. Then, from the back, came a voice. Soft, uncertain. It might be mine. Heads swiveled. It was Edna Lacey, the vicar's maid, standing half-shielded by the garden gate. Her face was pale, and she twisted her apron in trembling fingers. I used to write things down," she said. "Not bad things, just thoughts. I didn't think anyone would ever see them." Inspector Llewellyn stepped forward. "How did it end up under the cushion?" "I don't know." Her voice trembled. "I lost it weeks ago. I thought I'd dropped it near the well, but I couldn't find it." Miss Marple watched her. The girl was frightened, yes, but not guilty. Llewellyn asked, "And what was your connection with Mr. Harmon?" She hesitated. I cleaned his cottage, just once. The vicar let me earn a little on the side. Mr. Harmon said he wanted someone discreet." "And was he?" Edna's mouth twitched. "He kept too many boxes locked, said they were books, but I don't think they were." Miss Marple glanced at the diary again. The ink, the confessional tone. It was not Edna's voice, but the girl had seen something, or touched something. And now a threat had surfaced, buried beneath a garden chair. The villagers stood in murmuring confusion. Miss Marple folded the diary closed. She was beginning to see the pattern, not the full picture, not yet, but the corners were starting to line up. Someone had written a warning. Someone else had planted a book. The velvet curtain hadn't simply hid a body. It had hidden a face that someone could no longer afford to see in daylight. Inspector Llewellyn stood with the diary in one hand and a growing sense of unease in the other. The pages, creased and faintly scented with lavender, told a story of someone under pressure, possibly fearful, certainly secretive. But fear was abundant in St. Aldhelm's now, like the scent of overripe roses clinging to the edges of the garden. He glanced toward Edna Lacey, still trembling at the fringe of the crowd, and then toward Miss Marple, whose quiet gaze seemed to see more than the words on any page. "Miss Marple," he said under his breath, "you don't believe that girl wrote it, do you?" "I think," she said softly, "that Edna may have had it in her possession. But possession and authorship are different things. The voice on those pages belongs to someone with education and a tendency toward drama. Edna is simple and honest. No, I don't believe she wrote it." He frowned, flipping the diary closed. "Then who did?" "That," she replied, "is precisely the question you must ask, without appearing to ask it." Llewellyn narrowed his eyes. "You're suggesting I bait someone?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple murmured, "that the right comment in the right ear will often reveal far more than direct inquiry." Edna was being gently led away by the vicar's wife, who had resumed her matronly confidence with a strength born from years of managing Sunday rosters and turbulent confirmation classes. Miss Morley remained near the lemonade table, her glass now empty, her expression unreadable. A few villagers had wandered indoors under the pretense of helping tidy the drawing room, but most remained scattered about the lawn, unwilling to leave the scene before the final curtain. Miss Marple, after a brief internal consideration, walked toward the rose arbor again. Her steps were light and steady, as if she were simply admiring the blooms, but her eyes flicked to the stone frog where she'd found the letter earlier. The soil beneath it looked disturbed again. Not much, just a faint compression as though someone had knelt there since. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small notepad, the kind she kept for shopping lists, and carefully tore off a blank sheet. From her coat pocket, she produced a stub of pencil. She bent and knelt beside the frog, and with practiced hands wrote a brief message on the page. Then she folded it twice and slipped it back under the frog. The message read, "You were right to be afraid. But someone else already knows. We must speak before it's too late." She left it there and walked away without glancing back. Inside the vicarage, Constable Rowntree had been tasked with quietly searching Julian Harmon's pockets and effects. Inspector Llewellyn joined him in the study, an oak-panelled room that smelled faintly of beeswax and sermons, and watched as Rowntree laid out the contents of Harmon's pockets on a white cloth over the vicar's writing desk. "There's a theatre programme," Rowntree said, indicating the folded booklet. "From 1937, the Queen's Theatre, The Taming of the Shrew, underlined name, Elspeth Morley." Llewellyn exhaled. That confirms some history then. But why keep something so old in his coat pocket? Miss Marple's voice, unexpected and calm, came from the doorway. "Because he needed a reason to remember, or a reason not to forget." The inspector turned. "You believe he meant to confront her?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps to remind her that he had not. Sometimes a memory becomes leverage, particularly when one person has moved on and the other has not." She stepped further into the room and looked at the other items. A receipt for wine from Bellamy's shop, dated 3 days prior. A train stub to London, never used. And a torn envelope addressed to Julian Harmon in angular, deliberate handwriting. No return address. "Open that," Miss Marple said quietly. Rowntree did so, revealing a single slip of paper inside. It read only, "Final notice. You can't delay the truth forever." Llewellyn looked grim. "So we have 2 warnings, one left in the arbour and another in his coat. And the diary suggests a secret shared by at least 2 people. Which means," Miss Marple completed it for him, "that something long buried had recently begun to rise." Back in the garden, Evelyn Morley had drifted away from the lemonade table and was now speaking in hushed tones to Mrs. Everett near the hydrangeas. Both women glanced, almost in sync, toward the French doors leading into the drawing room. Miss Marple noticed. Llewellyn noticed as well. "Do they think we're not watching?" "They think we're watching the wrong things." Miss Marple replied. Which often we are. Do you suspect Miss Morley? Miss Marple hesitated. I suspect she had reason to hate him, but hate is not always enough. And Julian Harmon was not a man easy to hate without cause. That, in itself, is telling. A knock on the front door came, a brisk, officious rhythm that rang through the vicarage with the clarity of a bell tower on a clear day. Mrs. Finch answered it, and moments later returned with a man in his 60s, tall, hawk-nosed, wearing a dark coat and carrying a briefcase. He introduced himself in the study. Philip Larchmont, he said. I'm Julian Harmon's solicitor. I came from London. His housekeeper inquired after him when he failed to return last night. She telephoned me out of concern. Llewellyn stiffened. He was expected in London. Larchmont nodded. Indeed, he had intended to meet with me yesterday afternoon. Something about updating his will. There was a brief pause, charged and quiet. Did he say what prompted this change? Miss Marple asked gently. Only that he was leaving something to someone he hadn't previously mentioned. He called it a belated correction. The solicitor opened his briefcase and drew out a typed draft of the amended will. He asked me to prepare it ahead of our meeting, though he had not yet signed. Miss Marple read the name at the bottom of the added clause and felt a cold clarity settle over her. The name was Elspeth Morley. Inspector Llewellyn read it next and frowned. And she didn't mention this. She may not have known, Miss Marple said, but even as she said it, she doubted it. Outside, the air had shifted. Clouds had begun to gather, thick and silver-edged, pressing down on the summer warmth. Villagers began to murmur about storms and coverings, but Miss Marple stepped once more toward the rose arbour. The frog was askew. The note she'd planted beneath it was gone. She turned slowly, scanning the garden. Evelyn Morley was no longer in sight. Neither was Mrs. Everett. But something had changed. A current in the atmosphere, a subtle wrongness. She felt it then, not fear precisely, but the cold hand of consequence. Because someone had taken that note, and someone else was about to run out of time. The wind had begun to move in earnest now, not enough to scatter papers or upend parasols, but enough to set the lace curtain in the vicarage's guest room into motion again, like a breath exhaled in secret. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the lawn and watched it sway. That room had remained suspiciously empty all afternoon, despite the number of guests once expected. No one, as far as she had seen, had entered or exited it. Yet, twice now, something had moved within. She turned her gaze slowly across the garden. The villagers were thinning out. Some escorted home under pretense of nerves, others merely eager to be away before the weather broke. Constable Rowntree had stationed himself near the gate with the loyal purposefulness of a terrier, while Inspector Llewellyn stood with Philip Larchmont beneath the copper beech tree, speaking in quiet, clipped tones. Miss Marple approached him with a polite nod. "Forgive me for interrupting, Inspector, but I wonder, have you accounted for all who were present at the time of the performance?" Llewellyn looked up. "Nearly everyone, though I'm told Mrs. Everett left the gathering briefly to fetch a hat. And Miss Morley is no longer on the lawn," Miss Marple finished gently. "Nor is Mrs. Everett." He straightened. "You think they're together?" "I think they were speaking together a moment before they vanished. And I think Miss Morley read the note I left beneath the frog." Llewellyn glanced sharply at her. "You planted a note." She smiled faintly. A gentle prod to see who would feel compelled to act. And someone certainly has. Larchmont, the solicitor, shifted beside them. "Miss Morley, was she close to Mr. Harmon?" "She was once close enough for regret," Miss Marple said, "which, as I've often found, is closer than affection." Llewellyn gave a brisk nod. "Where would they have gone?" "I suggest the guest room. It offers seclusion and, more importantly, a view of the stage. Someone watched from there earlier, before the curtain was drawn, and after. I believe Miss Morley knows something that frightens her more than exposure." They moved at once, quickly, but without spectacle. Miss Marple's step was unhurried, yet purposeful, as they entered the vicarage. The drawing room was dim now, the sky outside having thickened with grey. They climbed the stairs, avoiding the creak on the third tread, and came to the door at the end of the hall. It was ajar. Llewellyn gestured for Rowntree, who had followed silently, to remain at the foot of the stairs. Then he pushed the door open. The room smelled faintly of violets and lavender polish. The bed was made, the rug straight, the windows open. And seated on the narrow bench beneath the far window was Evelyn Morley, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, standing near the dressing table, was Mrs. Everett. Neither woman looked surprised to see them. Miss Marple entered slowly, her eyes not on the faces, but on the space between them. Miss Morley spoke first. Her voice had steadied, but her knuckles were white against her skirt. "I didn't kill him." "No one has said you did," Miss Marple replied. "But you've been running from something all day." "I was hoping," Miss Morley said, "to leave before it caught up." Mrs. Everett turned sharply. "Don't say anything, Elspeth." But Elspeth Morley went on. "It doesn't matter anymore. Julian's dead. There's no point in holding secrets on his behalf." Llewellyn remained silent. Miss Marple gave a slight incline of the head, prompting her gently. "It was 1937, she said. "The play was The Taming of the Shrew. I was the understudy for Bianca. He was reviewing the performance. I was young, naive. He promised me a future, a role in London, connections, maybe even affection. He got neither in the end, only what he wanted for one night." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze softened. "He printed a brutal review 2 days later," Elspeth went on. "Mocked my voice, my posture, said I had the emotional range of a houseplant. That was the end of anything theatrical for me." Mrs. Everett's jaw was tight. "He didn't deserve your silence, Elspeth. He deserved ruin." "That's not why he died," Elspeth said quickly, looking at Llewellyn now. "He wasn't murdered because of me." "You believe someone else had motive?" the inspector asked. She hesitated, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a small tarnished ring. It was simple, a garnet set in gold. "This was mine," she said. "He gave it back to me 2 weeks ago. Said it was all that remained of that time. Said he was tired of hiding behind memory." Miss Marple stepped forward and took the ring gently in her hand. "And you believed him?" "I believed he meant it," Elspeth said. "That doesn't mean I forgave him." "But he still intended to leave you something," Llewellyn said. "You're named in the revised will." That caught her off guard. "He... what?" "You didn't know?" Miss Marple asked. "No." She looked genuinely stunned. "I didn't know." Mrs. Everett stepped forward. "Then someone else did." The room fell quiet. Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the dressing table. A single handkerchief lay there, embroidered with an E, and beside it, tucked beneath the powder jar, the corner of a paper envelope protruded. She picked it up. Inside was a letter, typed, unsigned, but unmistakably threatening. "You've done enough damage. It ends here. Don't attend the fete. Don't speak to her again. If you do, I'll come forward myself." Llewellyn read over her shoulder. "It wasn't just one person who hated him." "No," Miss Marple said, "but only one person was afraid of what he might say. Someone who knew about Elspeth and feared what it meant for their own standing." Her eyes drifted slowly back to Mrs. Everett. Mrs. Everett, who had stood beside Elspeth all day, defending, shielding, even now trying to steer the conversation away from certain details. "Elspeth," Miss Marple said gently, "how long have you and Mrs. Everett been friends?" "Since I came to St. Aldhelm's," she replied. "She was one of the only ones kind to me." Miss Marple nodded. "And before that? Did you know her as someone else?" The silence thickened. Mrs. Everett closed her eyes. "She knew me as Madeline Fairfax. That was my name before I married." Miss Marple turned to Llewellyn. "I imagine if we checked the records for the Queen's Theatre that year, we'd find Madeline Fairfax as the principal Bianca, and Julian Harmon, by all accounts, was quite fond of her. Elspeth's mouth parted slightly. You never told me that. There was nothing to tell, Mrs. Everett said, eyes brimming now. He ruined us both. I left London to escape the shame. He promised me a life too once. But when I hesitated, when I asked him to wait, he turned to you instead. Miss Marple was quiet. So when he returned here and began seeing Elspeth again, Mrs. Everett's voice broke. He was toying with her. I saw it happening all over again. I couldn't. But you didn't kill him, Miss Marple said gently. You wrote letters. You left warnings. You even tried to keep Elspeth away from the fete. She insisted on coming, Mrs. Everett whispered. And then he spoke to her after the rehearsal, said he had something to show her after the performance. You thought he would destroy her again, Miss Marple finished. So you tried to frighten him, but someone else had already decided it wasn't enough. Llewellyn looked between them. Then who gave him the poison? Miss Marple's eyes returned to the guest room window, where the curtain moved just slightly in the breeze. She didn't answer. Not yet. But she had an idea. Because velvet hides many things, and so does a paper cup. A hush had settled in the guest room, thicker than before, now bearing the weight of things unspoken. Miss Marple stepped back from the dressing table, her fingers still lightly touching the corner of the envelope, as if it might dissolve under her gaze. Inspector Llewellyn stood motionless by the door, his expression composed but alert, while Mrs. Everett gripped the edge of the window seat, looking anywhere but at Elspeth Morley. No one had spoken since Miss Marple mentioned the paper cup. That detail had dropped into the air like a stone into still water, yet it had rippled nothing. Not yet. Miss Marple folded her hands. When Julian Harmon sat behind the curtain, he did not sit idly. He was meant to reappear for the second act of the tableau, a modest trick of stagecraft, no doubt, but one that required him to remain quietly in position, just out of sight. He had a cup with him. I noticed it, paper, green stripe, from the refreshment table. Elspeth looked up. I saw one like that too. He had it when I passed behind the stage to collect my shawl. He was not holding it then, but it was on the table beside the throne, Miss Marple added gently. Placed deliberately where he might sip unnoticed. Llewellyn nodded. And if that drink had been tampered with, he would have no reason to suspect, Miss Marple finished. After all, the same cordial had been served to everyone, but that particular cup was separated, mildly chilled, no condensation. I thought it odd. You saw it? Llewellyn asked. I saw it being placed, she said, by a man who wore gloves despite the warmth of the afternoon. A pause, tight and sharp. Gloves? Llewellyn echoed. Only a few wore gloves, yourself, Miss Marple, and Mr. Edwin Blythe, she said softly, the choir director. Elspeth let out a soft breath, but it was not relief. Llewellyn turned toward Rowntree, who had appeared behind him, silent as always. Find Mr. Blythe, he ordered. Now. The constable nodded and vanished down the stair. Mrs. Everett stood slowly. Edwin? But he barely knew Julian. They argued about hymnals, but that's hardly... I believe, Miss Marple said, that Mr. Blythe knew more than he admitted. He often lingers after choir practice. That places him near the vestry, and the vestry, you may recall, shares a fence with Julian Harmon's back garden. But what motive? Llewellyn asked. This is still conjecture. Elspeth, Miss Marple said gently, was Mr. Blythe fond of you? The younger woman blinked, colour rising faintly in her cheeks. He was kind to me, brought me tea some afternoons, walked me home once or twice. I never encouraged anything, but I suppose he may have misunderstood. Not misunderstood, Miss Marple said gently. Assumed. There's a difference. The room fell silent again, thick with the things that lived just beneath the surface. 10 minutes passed before Rowntree returned. His face was flushed. He's not at the vicarage, he said, nor his cottage, but his bicycle is still near the choir loft. Llewellyn snapped to attention. He's hiding? Miss Marple shook her head. Number he's watching, waiting. For what? Elspeth asked. For confirmation that the secret has died with Julian Harmon, Miss Marple said, or whether someone else knows. Another pause, heavier than the last. I suggest, she said calmly, we return to the garden. There are eyes waiting for reactions. It would be wise to let them see the wrong ones. Llewellyn did not argue. They filed out in silence, leaving the guest room behind. As they reached the lower floor, the wind tugged at the French doors, flaring the white curtains like ghostly hands. Beyond, the garden looked unchanged, tables still askew, a lone scone abandoned on a napkin, and the velvet curtain of the stage fluttering faintly at the bottom hem. And standing just at the corner of the marquee, barely visible behind the pillar of the trellis, was Edwin Blythe. His expression was not startled. If anything, he looked resigned. Llewellyn stepped forward, but Miss Marple held him back with emotion. I think, she whispered, it is time for something quieter. She moved alone toward the man. Her pace was soft, neither hurried nor hesitant. He watched her come, arms folded, eyes calm. Miss Marple, he said, it's a curious day for justice. She stopped a few feet from him. Justice often wears borrowed shoes, Mr. Blythe. It arrives disguised as something else. Conscience, perhaps. His mouth twitched. Is that what this is? Conscience. I rather think it is fear, she said gently. Fear that someone, like Julian Harmon, might lift the wrong veil at the wrong time. He didn't reply. I believe, she went on, that you heard things. Through the vestry fence. Perhaps even watched. Elspeth receiving the ring, the conversations on the back path. You must have seen him hand her the theatre programme. Edwin's eyes lowered slightly. Such a trivial thing, Miss Marple said. A keepsake, yes, but also a warning. That the past can return. That something which seems forgotten has only been sleeping. His voice, when it came, was brittle. He would have hurt her again. Miss Marple said nothing. I knew his kind. I'd seen it before. Flattery, flattery, then the ruin. So you decided, she said softly, that he must not have the chance. He looked up at her, and for a moment his face was unreadable. Then, very slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a pair of gloves. White, spotless. He held them loosely in his hands. I didn't mean to kill him. I only meant to scare him, just enough. A bitter cordial, that's all. Something to make him ill. Let the performance falter. Let Elspeth see who he really was. But he drank more than you expected, she said. Yes. He looked away. He stayed behind the curtain too long. A breeze caught the velvet behind them. It billowed briefly, then settled. Llewellyn approached quietly, and Edwin did not resist when the inspector placed a hand on his shoulder. There's a bottle, Edwin said, in my vestry drawer, labelled liniment. It's not. Miss Marple watched him walk away without expression. The garden, so quiet now, seemed frozen in tableau itself. No applause, no curtain call. Later, when the villagers began speaking again, it would be said that justice had been done swiftly and without spectacle, that Edwin Blythe had acted with a misguided heart, that Elspeth Morley bore her grief with quiet dignity. But Miss Marple, as she returned to her seat by the hydrangeas, thought of something else entirely. The way guilt clings not only to the guilty, the way the smallest gesture, an old theatre programme, a paper cup, can unravel the polite fiction of village life, and the way velvet, soft as it seems, can conceal more than one performance. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for the first raindrop to fall. The first drop of rain fell not long after Edwin Blythe was escorted quietly through the side gate. His hands folded before him, his expression somewhere between blankness and release. It struck the corner of the lemonade tablecloth and left a round, dark mark, as though the garden itself were exhaling. The villagers who remained, fewer now, hushed and pale, stood motionless beneath umbrellas, or watched from the edges of the vicarage's covered porch, murmuring behind cupped hands as though afraid their words might stir the air too much. Miss Marple did not move from her chair beside the hydrangeas. Her gloves, still, immaculate, lay folded on her lap. She had not spoken since the inspector's quiet "thank you" before he'd followed Blythe and Rowntree toward the police car that now waited on the far lane with its lights discreetly off. The rain deepened. Not a downpour, but a steady tapping, on leaves, on canvas, on stone, and with it came a strange kind of stillness, not just of silence but of understanding settling into the bones of the place. Julian Harmon was dead. Edwin Blythe had confessed. Yet something delicate and incomplete lingered in the atmosphere, like a phrase half-finished or a scene not fully rehearsed. Miss Marple tilted her head as she watched the stage, now deserted, but not empty. A thread pulled quietly at the edge of her thoughts, something that refused to fit. She rose. Inside the vicarage, Inspector Llewellyn stood at the sideboard in the study, gently shaking water from his coat sleeves. His notebook was open, the diary and the letter from Julian's pockets spread on the table like playing cards in a losing hand. Miss Marple entered without knocking, her presence soft but unmistakable. Llewellyn looked up, expectant. "I'm not interrupting," she said, "but I believe something has been misunderstood." He raised an eyebrow. "You think Blythe was lying?" "No," she said calmly. "But I believe Edwin Blythe told the truth as he saw it, which is not always the same as the full truth." Llewellyn folded his arms. "Go on." "He believed he poisoned Julian Harmon, believed it sincerely. But the effect of what he administered, bitter cordial laced with something to cause nausea, would not have killed a healthy man in less than 20 minutes, and certainly not with the physical signs Dr. Finch observed." "You're saying Harmon was already dying?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied, "that something else was introduced, something far more final." Llewellyn exhaled slowly. "Then there's another hand in this." Miss Marple nodded. "Which fits the timeline. Harmon had time to drink, to speak with Elspeth briefly near the hydrangeas, and then return to his place behind the curtain. If Blythe's poison was the only one, Harmon would have grown unsteady, perhaps ill, but not silent so quickly, and not with that particular flush to the skin." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You believe the second dose came after he was already seated?" "Yes." Her gaze dropped to the diary on the table. "And I believe someone else knew Blythe intended to do something, knew enough to prepare their own act, one far more permanent." Llewellyn looked down at the diary too. "Elspeth?" "No." Her voice was certain. Miss Morley was angry, wounded, but she was not vengeful. And she didn't know about the will. She had no reason to act quickly, but someone else did. He frowned. Someone who knew about the bequest? Miss Marple's hands moved, slowly unfolding her gloves. "You'll recall that the will was never signed, which means the information could have come from only two people, Julian himself or Mr. Larchmont." The inspector stared at her. "The solicitor? He arrived too quickly, with documents prepared but unsigned, and a clear knowledge of the intended changes. Yet Julian Harmon had postponed the meeting. According to Larchmont, Julian was meant to visit him, not the other way round." Llewellyn blinked. "So why did he come to St. Aldhelm's at all?" Miss Marple stepped closer to the table and gently tapped the letter recovered from Julian's pocket. "Because this letter was never posted, no stamp, and it's typed." Llewellyn glanced down. "Typed? Of course." "Julian didn't type," Miss Marple said. "He always wrote longhand. Mr. Larchmont must have typed this himself, carried it here, slipped it into Harmon's coat either to create the illusion of external threat or to cover for something worse." The inspector's face darkened. "You think the solicitor killed him?" "I think Mr. Larchmont came here to ensure that Julian Harmon did not live to sign a revised will that would exclude him as executor and beneficiary. You'll find, I expect, that Larchmont was named in the previous version. perhaps discreetly, but quite securely. Llewellyn picked up the draft of the new will, flicking through it with a fresh eye. His brows pulled together. Yes, Harmon had removed Larchmont entirely, appointed Elspeth Morley's name in every relevant section, alongside an unnamed future executor. That would have cut the solicitor out of everything. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. And that, Inspector, is why he couldn't allow Julian to live. Blythe's mischief provided a perfect cover. A local man with a clear, if tragic, motive. All it required was a small substitution. Perhaps a second cup, already laced, switched behind the stage just before the curtain call. Llewellyn sat slowly. The performance wasn't just on the stage. No, she said. It never is. They found Larchmont at the Blue Goose Cafe 20 minutes later, seated at a corner table with a single cup of tea and a plate of untouched currant biscuits. His briefcase rested beside him like a loyal dog. When Llewellyn approached, flanked by Rowntree, the solicitor didn't even flinch. He folded his napkin, dabbed his mouth, and said only, "I wondered how long it would take her." Back at the vicarage, the rain had lightened to a mist. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the rose arbour, watching the curtain flutter one last time before the wind let it go. The chair behind it had been removed. The stage was being taken down by young Stephen and his older brother, under orders from the vicar, who had decided there would be no more tableau this season. Elspeth Morley emerged from the side path, wrapped in a grey shawl. "May I?" she asked. Miss Marple nodded. They stood in silence. "He was going to make amends," Elspeth said finally. "That's the part I can't quite get past." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "we are forgiven just a moment too late." They watched the curtain fall together, not with drama, but with quiet finality. And in the hush that followed, the village of St. Aldhelms resumed breathing. The morning after the garden fete dawned pale and sodden, the hedgerows still glistening with last night's rain, the cobbled high street running quietly beneath the dull churn of early deliveries. St. Aldhelms wore the hush of recovery. Curtains stayed drawn longer than usual. The Blue Goose, often lively by 8, had only one patron seated by the window with a half-drunk pot of tea. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, a fire kindled in the grate despite the season, her knitting untouched in her lap. The Daily Chronicle, neatly folded on the table beside her, bore a modest column on the death of Julian Harmon. Theatre critic dies at village fundraiser. Police investigation ongoing. No mention of Edwin Blythe. No mention of Philip Larchmont. Just the sort of dignified omission that Miss Marple found both relieving and unfortunate. Truth had a way of being papered over with polite phrases when it didn't suit the reputation of the living. She was not expecting a caller, so when the front door rattled gently at the knocker, once, then twice, she was already rising. It was Elspeth Morley. She looked exhausted, though not undone. Her coat was damp at the hem, and her shoes, Miss Marple noted, had not been brushed before stepping out. That told her more than the tightness of the younger woman's mouth or the faint tremor of her hands. "Do come in, dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "I was just thinking about the tea." Elspeth stepped inside without speaking and followed Miss Marple into the sitting room, as if drawn there by invisible thread. She sat without being asked and stared into the fire. "I'm sorry," she said after a long pause. "I just didn't want to be alone." "You're not the only one feeling that this morning," Miss Marple replied gently, pouring the tea. "Milk?" Elspeth nodded. "Yes, please." They sat in silence a moment longer, the clink of the spoon the only sound between them. Outside, a sparrow flitted beneath the window ledge, indifferent to human sorrows. "I should feel something," Elspeth said at last. "Rage, relief. I don't know, but I just feel emptied out, like someone's taken a penknife and scraped away the part that had any story left to tell." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Sometimes what we feel doesn't arrive in time to be useful. It lags behind the facts like a coat left on the hook long after the rain has passed. Elspeth gave a ghost of a smile. You always sound as though you've lived through everything already. Miss Marple tilted her head. Not everything, dear, but more than most. They sipped, their tea in companionable quiet, and Miss Marple let the stillness hold for a while longer before speaking again. I believe it matters that you came here, she said. It tells me you understand something very important. Elspeth looked at her. What's that? That forgiveness, Miss Marple said softly, is not the same as forgetting. Elspeth set her cup down. He wanted to make things right. I believe he did, Miss Marple said. And yet, that does not erase the harm done before, nor the way he tried to manage it, as though generosity, offered late and privately, might wipe the slate clean. People are not chalkboards, not even critics. Elspeth let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. I keep wondering if I should have refused the ring, if I'd told him to keep it, if that would have changed things. It might have changed the shape of the day, Miss Marple said, but not the substance of it. Mr. Larchmont acted out of his own fears, his own ambitions. He might have found another opportunity. And Mr. Blythe, poor man, was already building a tragedy in his head before the curtain ever lifted. Elspeth leaned back in the chair, as if the weight of it all had finally settled where she could reach it. And Mrs. Everett? She will carry her own guilt, I imagine, Miss Marple said. But hers was not the hand that stirred the cup. She tried to protect you, blinded by her own memory, yes, but from something that once hurt her deeply. I think in time you might come to understand her more than you expect. They sat again in silence. I don't know what I'll do now, Elspeth murmured. It feels foolish to return to the piano, and yet I don't have much else. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. The piano has never required more than truth, and you have that now. Perhaps, once the village forgets the headlines, they'll remember how lovely your playing is. Elspeth blinked quickly and gave a tiny nod. I hope so. They finished their tea, and Miss Marple insisted on wrapping a slice of lemon cake for her visitor before she left. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly, the clouds thinning to show slivers of sky like torn silk. Elspeth walked away slowly, the box in her hands, her head high, not unbowed, but steadier. Miss Marple returned to her chair. By mid-morning, the vicar had called, stammering his gratitude for her help, asking gently whether she might join the church council again this autumn. She declined, as she always did, but with such politeness that he left feeling rather buoyed. Later, Mrs. Finch stopped by with a jar of her gooseberry preserve just in case the week had been a trying one, and stayed longer than she'd planned, quietly reassured by Miss Marple's presence. It wasn't until the afternoon post arrived that the last thread began to tie itself into the whole. Among the letters, a seed catalogue, a thank you note from a niece, and a thin envelope with no return address. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, cream-coloured paper. Typed. There were 2 cups. I watched him choose the wrong one. No signature. No indication of who had written it. Just those words, centred and clean, as if the writer had known they didn't need to explain further. Miss Marple read the note 3 times, then folded it slowly. It did not surprise her. Not anymore. Behind every stage, someone always waits in the wings. A hidden cue, a last-minute adjustment, a subtle intervention, quiet enough that even death might mistake it for chance. But someone had known. Someone had chosen not to stop it. Miss Marple set the note aside and reached for her knitting. There were many ways to keep the truth alive. One did not always need to speak it aloud. Outside, the wind lifted again. The curtain in her window stirred once and fell still. The note remained where Miss Marple had set it, folded once, tucked under the edge of her knitting basket. She had not hidden it, nor had she displayed it. It sat quietly in that liminal space between significance and silence, much like the conscience of the unknown hand that had sent it. She knew enough now not to chase every thread to its fraying end. Some knots held tighter when pulled. Others, when left alone, simply unraveled themselves in time. By midweek, the village had returned to its rhythms, though not quite the same ones. The vicarage garden, stripped of bunting and silence, looked oddly exposed without the stage. The path where Julian Harmon's body had been carried away had been swept 3 times by the curate, though no one had asked him to. The Blue Goose Cafe served its scones with a quiet wariness, as if flavour itself might conceal secrets. And though polite conversation resumed in the greengrocer's and the post office queue, it did so with a new kind of restraint, like a page turned too carefully for fear it might tear. Miss Morley had resumed her piano lessons. Mrs. Everett had stopped wearing red. Constable Rowntree now crossed the street with noticeably more deference when he passed Miss Marple, though she pretended not to notice. As for Inspector Llewellyn, he had returned to Much Benham with a letter of commendation from the chief superintendent, a stack of paperwork, and a quiet private sense that the truth had extended 1 notch deeper than the official record would allow. It was Friday when the second note arrived. This time, it was slipped not through the front door, but into her library copy of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, left for her at the Women's Institute reading table. She discovered it at home, nestled between the last 2 pages, folded with the same tidy precision. No envelope, no address, just the note. He never drank from his own cup. He waited for her to bring it. She switched them back. Miss Marple stared at the words for a long moment, the wool of her shawl still clinging to her fingers. They were typed again. No flourish, no attempt at disguise beyond the utter plainness of the thing. She did not blink. Instead, she rose, placed the kettle back on the hob, and walked to her writing desk. From a small drawer she retrieved the original note, the one she'd received days ago, and laid them side by side. The same typewriter, same spacing, same careful economy of line. Not a confession, not quite. But someone had seen something, twice, or someone had known. It didn't change the outcome. Julian Harmon was dead. Edwin Blythe had confessed to his own part, and Larchmont had been formally charged with administering the fatal dose. His motive had been clear, his opportunity ironclad, and his hands, as the post-mortem had revealed, untraceably clean. But these notes offered a third angle. Not the administration of the poison, but the opportunity for it to reach its target. Miss Marple thought carefully. She returned to the detail she had nearly dismissed during the earliest hours of the case, the moment Harmon had first taken the cup. A green-striped paper vessel, half filled with cordial, placed upon the table behind the curtain. She had watched it being set down, yes, but she had not, at that moment, known who had poured it. Not Edwin Blythe. He had approached later, with gloves and quiet hands. But someone else had hovered near the refreshment table during that interval. Someone who had worn perfume, notably strong that day. Someone who had offered help arranging the paper napkins, and who had moved between the marquee and the rear garden path several times. Mrs. Finch, the doctor's wife. Quiet, brisk, always helpful, always unobtrusive. She had spoken to Julian Harmon, Miss Marple remembered now, just briefly beneath the sycamore, while he was adjusting his cufflinks. It had seemed unremarkable at the time, just the sort of mingling that occurred at village events. But now, with the framing of the notes, it gained new dimension. Miss Marple folded both pages carefully and placed them back into her basket. She did not act immediately. Instead, she waited. And as always, the waiting brought results. It was the following Tuesday, during her usual walk to the post office, when she encountered Mrs. Finch on the lane between the allotments and the churchyard. The air was bright, too clear to be trusted in spring, and Miss Marple had paused to examine a pale bloom of crocus before noticing the other woman approaching with a wicker basket and a slightly breathless smile. "Good morning," Mrs. Finch said. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied. "I've just sent a note to my cousin in Bournemouth. She's had trouble with blackfly in her dahlias, most inconvenient. Mrs. Finch offered a sympathetic sound. We've had such trouble with pests this season, haven't we? And with misunderstandings, Miss Marple said softly. Though those, I fear, are harder to prune. There was a subtle stilling in the air, not dramatic, barely perceptible. But Mrs. Finch's smile held one beat too long, and her fingers flexed once around the basket handle. I received a note, Miss Marple continued, rather two notes, from someone who saw what they oughtn't have, or perhaps saw precisely what they intended. Mrs. Finch did not speak. Miss Marple tilted her head, gaze gentle. You knew Julian Harmon's intentions regarding Elspeth, didn't you? A pause. Then, he came to the surgery, Mrs. Finch said quietly. The week before the fete. He was flushed, unsteady. He asked about anxiety remedies, something to help with sleep. He said he'd made mistakes, that he wanted to make peace. I wanted to believe him. But you didn't. I believed he would leave destruction again, Mrs. Finch said, her voice low. To her, to the village, to those of us who have spent years knitting things back together. I watched him whisper to her in the garden. I saw her eyes afterward. She looked the same way I did 30 years ago. I couldn't bear it. Miss Marple nodded, the movement small, unhurried. I didn't poison him, Mrs. Finch said. I didn't touch his drink, but I saw what Edwin Blythe did. I saw him hesitate, and when Harmon looked away, I switched the cups back. And let him drink the one meant to frighten him. Mrs. Finch's hands trembled now. Yes. Miss Marple said nothing. I thought it would only make him ill, Mrs. Finch whispered. That perhaps it would shake him, show him someone was watching. But someone else, Miss Marple finished gently, counted on that hesitation. Mrs. Finch looked away, toward the stone wall where moss had begun to creep. I didn't mean for him to die, she said, but I didn't stop it either. No, Miss Marple said, but you're not alone in that. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded page, the second note. She handed it over without comment. Mrs. Finch took it with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned it once, then again. I never wrote these, she said. I know, Miss Marple replied, but someone wanted you to read them, and now that you have, I think they'll stop writing. Mrs. Finch clutched the paper, her breath thin. What should I do? Live with it, Miss Marple said, and be kinder to the next person who looks lost in the garden. She touched the woman's arm lightly, then continued her walk up the lane, her steps steady and slow, the breeze tugging gently at the edge of her scarf. Behind her, the village held its breath once more, but only for a moment. Then the world exhaled again, and the crocuses continued to bloom. The next few days passed, with a slow, deliberate calm, the kind that only visits a village after something momentous has occurred, and life is determined to behave as though it hasn't. The sun broke through at last, tentative at first, then gaining, confidence, casting long beams across the hedgerows and drawing the scent of warming earth into the lanes. Children reappeared in the green square with marbles and chalk. A cake sale was planned, postponed, and planned again. The church bulletin, as ever, made no mention of Julian Harmon. Miss Marple tended to her roses in the early morning and answered her letters in the afternoon. Her days moved forward with their usual gentleness, but her mind did not stray far from the notes, or the silence that had followed. There were no more anonymous messages, no sudden visitors, no second-hand confessions whispered in shaded lanes. Just the quiet hush of villagers avoiding one another's eyes when passing too closely near the vicarage, or the stage now stacked neatly in the parish shed. But silence was never the same as resolution, and in Miss Marple's experience, it often arrived not as an ending, but as a pause. The truth, she had found, preferred doorways to conclusions. It lingered in hesitation, In the breath someone didn't quite take. In the sentence someone left unfinished, even when they'd intended to lie. So, when she received an invitation on Sunday morning, handwritten, careful script on cream stationery, delivered by hand, she knew precisely whose door it would lead her to. Elspeth Morley answered it herself. Her face looked thinner now, but not hollow. There was clarity in her gaze, something steadier than the fear that had haunted her after the curtain's fall. She wore a grey dress and no lipstick. The piano, visible beyond the sitting room, bore a vase of daffodils and an open book of Chopin. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I didn't want to send for you like a summons. I just thought perhaps it was time." Miss Marple stepped inside and nodded. The truth always knows when to ask for company. They sat in the small parlour. The windows were open, letting in the smell of cut grass and the faint hum of distant bees. Elspeth poured tea, her hands steady now, and said nothing until they were both settled. "Something's been bothering me," she began. "Not about Julian, not anymore. I've accepted that chapter is closed. What's been turning in my head is, who knew, not just what he'd done, but what he planned to do?" Miss Marple gave her a slight nod, not prompting, only encouraging. Elspeth continued. "He told me the day before the fete that he'd made arrangements, that things were in writing. He said it quietly, almost like it was a gift he didn't want me to unwrap too soon. I didn't think much of it at the time. People say all sorts of things when they're feeling guilty. But now—" "You think someone else overheard?" Miss Marple said gently. "Yes." Elspeth folded her hands. "Not Mrs. Everett, not Edwin, not even Larchmont. Someone who was there in that moment, when we were near the back of the tent, near the curtain." Miss Marple's eyes didn't move, but her thoughts did. "That space was never as private as people imagined," she said softly. "Between the refreshment table and the rose arbor and the path toward the rear steps, 3 or 4 people could have passed through unnoticed in the course of a minute, but only someone with a reason would have paused." Elspeth hesitated, then leaned forward. "There was a man. Quiet, older, thinning hair. He wasn't local, I don't think, but I saw him at the edge of the tent just after Julian left me. I remember because he seemed to hesitate, then turned back as though he'd changed his mind about something." Miss Marple's fingers tightened very slightly around the teacup. "Was he carrying anything?" "A small black case, like a briefcase, but worn." There it was. "Mr. Larchmont," Miss Marple said, confirming softly what Elspeth already suspected. "He arrived earlier than he claimed. He told the inspector he had come directly from London that afternoon, but the constable who met him at the train said Larchmont had already walked up from the village side." Elspeth's brow furrowed. "So he was already nearby?" "Very likely," Miss Marple said, waiting for his moment, watching. "He knew Julian intended to rewrite the will, and I believe he feared Julian might choose to formalize it publicly at the fete, perhaps even hand it to you himself. But Julian never did." He was interrupted, or hesitant, but Larchmont's fear had already driven him to act. He brought a prepared will, unsigned, hoping to create confusion later, and I suspect he brought more than documents. Elspeth looked down at her lap, silent for a moment. "Do you think," she said finally, "that any of them would have acted if Julian had spoken his intentions aloud?" Miss Marple was quiet. "Perhaps not that day, but something would have come eventually. Truth rarely sits quietly in a locked drawer." "I keep thinking," Elspeth said slowly, "about that last time he looked at me. When he sat behind the curtain, he raised his hand, just briefly, as if to wave or to speak. But then he just settled into the chair." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He may have known something was wrong." Elspeth's gaze turned toward the piano. "I don't think he wanted to run anymore. That's what frightens me most. He wasn't the man he once was, and maybe he really did want to change. and he died before he could prove it. Miss Marple set her cup down. Redemption is a very stubborn thing. People think it's a grand gesture, a confession or a sacrifice, but it's usually something far smaller. A ring returned, a name remembered, a cup passed quietly from one hand to another. They sat in silence after that. Eventually, Miss Marple stood. "You'll be all right, Miss Morley. Not because time makes things easier, it doesn't, but because you're no longer holding someone else's guilt." Elspeth rose too, the sunlight catching her cheekbone. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what others didn't." Miss Marple gave a modest smile. "Old habits. I've spent a lifetime watching faces behind curtains." She stepped into the garden and walked the path back toward the lane. At the bend, she paused. A young girl from the village, no more than 10, was hopping along the low wall with a skipping rope trailing from her hand. She paused and asked Miss Marple if she wanted to see her jump. Miss Marple agreed and clapped politely at the end. Life, she thought, was remarkably adept at continuing, even when the curtains fall, even when there is no applause. The stage is cleared. The truth, such as it is, returns to silence. And the village begins again. The afternoon sun dipped low over St. Aldhelm's, casting long shadows across the village green and gilding the church steeple with a soft golden light. The bustle of the last few days had settled into a quiet that felt both a relief and a burden, as if the village were holding its breath, waiting for closure that remained just beyond reach. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, a cup of cooling tea resting on the table beside her, fingers lightly tracing the delicate embroidery of her handkerchief. The notes, the whispered confidences, the hidden glances, all had woven themselves into a tapestry she was now ready to unravel. The doorbell chimed softly, and without waiting for an invitation, Inspector Llewellyn stepped inside, his manner brisk yet tinged with respect. He carried with him the air of a man who had reached the end of a long, twisting path. "Miss Marple," he began, settling into the chair opposite her. "I must admit, I'm grateful for your insights these past days. They have illuminated corners I hadn't thought to examine." She smiled gently. "We all see what we expect, Inspector. Sometimes it takes an outsider to notice the things hidden in plain sight." He nodded. "Well, your suspicions about Mr. Larchmont were correct. We have evidence placing him near the garden shortly before Mr. Harmon's death. His alibi was less than convincing. And what of the gloves, the second cup? Found in his office, a paper cup with traces of the same poison. He intended to administer the fatal dose himself, but Mr. Blythe's misguided attempt preceded him. A terrible accident of timing." Miss Marple inclined her head. A tragedy compounded by fear and desperation. But what of Mrs. Finch? "She admitted to switching the cups back," Llewellyn said quietly. "Her intentions were protective, misguided as they were. She wanted to scare Mr. Harmon, to prevent more pain, not to cause death." The room held the weight of that confession. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the last light caught the edge of a lace curtain, fluttering faintly in the evening breeze. "Justice," she mused softly, "is seldom neat or kind. It is a matter of seeing clearly, even when the view is uncomfortable." A knock interrupted them, and Elspeth Morley entered quietly. Her face was calm, touched with the grace of someone who had faced her ghosts and laid them to rest. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, voice steady, "for helping me understand what happened, for showing me that sometimes the past need not define the future." Miss Marple smiled. "It never does, dear, especially when we have the courage to turn the page." As the evening shadows lengthened, the village of St. Aldhelm's began to breathe again, not the cautious breath of suspicion, but the quiet exhale of a community healing. And behind the curtains, both literal and figurative, the truth settled softly, revealed, reconciled, and finally at peace.